Okay, so as much as I wanted this to be the last piece, I'm going to have to do specificity for hypertrophy next week, and then I swear to God I'll move on. So today, continuing, I'm going to look at the weight room specificity for non-weight room sports, endurance sports, team sports, sprint power sports, before looking at how it applies or doesn't apply to strongman, strongwoman, strong person, whatever it's called, Olympic weightlifting, and then finally powerlifting. And I know I promised a bunch of internet bullshit drama, but I think I'm going to make that into a separate little series because then they could be shorter and more people will see them. Let's get started. First, let me talk a little bit about the idea of weight room specificity as it applies to non-strength sports, by which I mean, again, powerlifting, Olympic lifting, strongman, and bodybuilding isn't a sport anyway. So I'm talking about the idea of using training in the weight room for running or cycling or team sports or things of that nature, where people forget, and I will mention this again, that the weight room is nothing more than general physical preparation. There is nothing you can do in the weight room that is going to improve your performance in MMA, in BJJ, than practicing your sport. The weight room is general physical preparation, and this gets forgotten. And I don't think it's as common now, except among the truly stupid shit. But back in the day, right, when the NSCA was trying to pretend that a bunch of strength coaches were scientists and all of this, whereas a bunch of Olympic lifting advocates, enthusiasts, justifying their bias, there were arguments for decades over American football, a team sport where strength is, at best, a moderately important biomotor capacity depending on the event. And I swear to fucking kid you not, if the team that won the Super Bowl used Olympic lifts were superior. And if they happened to win using Nautilus machines or hammer machines, then that was the way you should train. Although the Olympic lifting biased people would find a way that if their guys won, it was a strength and conditioning program. But if the Nautilus guys won, it was because they were just more skilled. But that's just it. The skill beats it. See this stuff in a lot of the old Eastern European and Soviet manuals. For example, Vladimir Zatsiorsky in his book would talk about working in like the domain of angular specificity, and you would see exercises like this for running. So they would determine that the maximum force was in that that dark triangle, and then try to set the exercise to train that specific movement. And you'll see other ideas like this. There was a thing out in Salt Lake City, a sports-specific training program that just did the most ridiculous shit, where they would have people they have kids throw a baseball against like tubing resistance, which all that does is fuck up your neuromuscular patterns. But I'm sure you've seen guys like trying to mimic punching for MMA with a movement, or, a cable, or God forbid a dumbbell because gravity points down, you morons, and like trying to be specific, and it's dumb. A favorite example, I have this terrible running book by these two European guys, and they have in the back of it all these running specific strength training exercises, one of which like this, which they describe as a body snap to step up to knee lift or some shit like that. And it's just dozens of these things. And the fact is that the best runners, the Kenyans and the Ethiopians, do none of this shit. They run, and they run up and down hills. And that's it. The studies notwithstanding, long duration distance cyclists don't lift weights either unless they have no other option because it's winter and they can't do a lot of riding. They would rather go climb hills in a lower gear. That's how they build their specific strength. It's not doing one-legged bullshit in the weight room. And in the endurance sports specifically, it makes even less sense. I mean, swimming is weird because water is kind of pseudo-isokinetic, but swimmers have been going back and forth for decades about whether they should use tubing or heavy weights or the swim bench, and fuck it, nobody knows how to train for swimming, I'm convinced. Even if you're talking about MMA, despite apparently Mike Israetel claiming that the reason small guys can't bunch hard enough because they can't bench 400, the power comes from the hips, right? All this upper body bullshit, and all it does is fuck up your neuromuscular patterns. A fist doesn't weigh that much. It's not a strength move, it's a speed move, it's a technique move. And the endurance events just don't have that kind of high force capacity. Coggin has his little grid, and he's like, even like climbing hills, it's not a strength activity. Now, when you get in the team sports, it's a little more variable. I mean, American football has a strength component, rugby has a strength component, but I know one of the top rugby coaches over in Ireland, they don't do specific stuff. They get them strong. Mainly they do a lot of injury prevention to keep them from breaking, because that's common in those sports. And you will see specific injury prevention exercises depending on the sport, but it's not trying to mimic the fucking sporting movement. When you get into some of the sprint power events, where weight strength is a little bit more important, like starting out of the blocks in the 100-meter does require a lot of strength. Track cycling starts, which require an enormous amount of strength, and they do a ton of weight training, very heavy. And some systems use a lot of one-legged work. Again, that unilateral, bilateral deficit, but many don't. But it only helps that one component of it because it cannot build other things. Especially when you get back into those old ideas about Bompa had the transition to speed, where you went from doing your heavy lifting to doing faster lifting. And the reality is nothing you can do in the weight room approximates the speeds of most sports. Like, it can't even get close. So it's kind of non-productive. Basically, even like look at shot putters. Those guys used to have like 600-pound partial squats, and they just don't do that anymore because it's a technique sport now. It's a speed sport. It's a power sport. All that extra strength didn't do any good. I mean, Bondarchuk's about the only one who used specific training for his throwers, but throwing is a weirdly fucked sport. A lot of rotational stuff, like, fine. But by and large, you just don't see this being done anymore outside of morons because it doesn't work. You just don't get that sort of transfer. I mean, when we speed skated, we did a lot of one-leg work, but speed skating is also basically an explosive one-legged jump from side to side. We also did use that to develop stability, at least first season, because to get better at standing on one leg. But as far as specific movement patterns, the general trend in the modern era is use the weight room to get strong and then go practice your fucking sport. And that will integrate any strength improvements, assuming it's even relevant to your sport, into it. And all these other arguments and specificity, and like I said, the American football thing is hilarious. And probably my favorite example, or one of them, came from the NSCA textbook, where they said, I kid you not, that tricep pushdowns were specific to basketball because of the dribbling. And you can't make shit that dumb up, folks. You just can't. Like I said, weight room work for non-weight room sports is general physical preparation and should be treated as such. Get strong in the weight room, maybe do some injury prevention stuff, go practice your sport. Moving on. Now we get into the strength sports, by which I mean strongman, strong person, strong woman, still don't know. Powerlifting and Olympic lifting, things change. Because now, the strongman is unique. What you're doing in the weight room is the competition activity. It's not like using the weight room for non-weight room sports. So the rules and the approach and what I'm going to talk about does change. So strongman, again, is in kind of a weird hybrid place between the non-strength sports and the pure strength sports. As I mentioned in another video, you can't just do the competition events constantly because equipment availability and you get beaten up. Once you have the events for a given competition, you can gear your weight room work far more specifically to those activities. And many of them are, right? If you're doing a deadlift for reps or push press with lug, well, you can practice that with a push press and a deadlift. So like I said, you can get much more specific, but you can't be completely specific. So let's look at the pure strength sport. So a quick preface on Olympic lifting or weightlifting, as the people who get really uptight over words insist that it be called. It is a competition sport where you perform two lifts. The snatch, where a weight is lifted from floor to overhead in one smooth movement. And the clean and jerk, where it's lifted from floor to shoulders, and then you stand up and then you put it overhead in what's called the jerk. You do this one time, you get 3 attempts in each competition, and the goal is to lift the most weight possible. And that's it. Compared to other sports, it is extremely simple in terms of its biomotor capacities and demands. Huge technical component, huge. One of the most technically demanding sports, especially the snatch, in existence. And that will be reflected in what's done. Maximum strength plays a role up to a point, but beyond a certain point, it's an explosive movement. Right? To put this in perspective, a maximum clean and jerk is about 80 to 85% of your maximum deadlift. So it's, relatively speaking, sub-maximal. A snatch is about 80% of the best clean and jerk. It's about 65%. It's a speed movement. Does it require some strength? Yes, but it is mostly a speed and technical movement. And that's pretty much it. There is no endurance component. There is a work capacity component, being able to survive the often exhausting training. But back in the day, the Eastern European lifters were known for smoking in between lifts and during training. Because when you're doing a single or a double or a triple that's over in a few seconds, aerobic fitness does not play a role. But because of that, Olympic lifting, like powerlifting discussed next, is one of the only two sports where you can actually simply do the competition during training. Again, you don't see that in other sports. A 100-meter sprinter doesn't just go run 100 meters all out. Tour de France cyclist doesn't just go ride the Tour de France. A marathon runner does not run a marathon every day. In Olympic weightlifting, you can simply do the competition and training. And as you'll see, in some cases, nothing but that. So for that to make sense, a brief overview of sort of Olympic training methods over the decades. So when the Americans were dominant in the mid-20th century, most of them came from a strength and bodybuilding background. They did that most of the year, totally non-specific training. And then they'd slot in the Olympic lifts towards the end. And they were dominant, but there's a couple of factors several to keep in mind. One, technique of the day was not nearly as refined as it is now. It was much rougher, and you could get by on pure strength. Two, there was a third event at the time, the clean and press, which allowed them to get by on more maximum strength, which is what they liked. But three, the big players, the Eastern Europeans, the Germans, weren't on the playfield yet because they were rebuilding from the war. Because as they started to get international sport for political reasons and started throwing endless resources at analyzing this sport as its own sport rather than a spin-off from what the Americans like to do, they started stomping the Americans' ass because that non-specific training, doing Olympic lifts occasionally on a base of lots of max strength and power rack work, just didn't pay the bills anymore. So that brings me to sort of the Russian approach, which was huge amounts of variety in a relative sense. Now, their lifters always did the Olympic lifts to one degree or another because they knew that you had to practice them a lot, like all other sports. The difference being that they did a lot more what we now call like accessory assistance movements, accessory or supplemental. Again, I'm too dumb and stupid to remember, keep track of which is which. So you saw lots of things, lots of variance on the clean and jerk, lots of variance on the snatch. If you ever have the misfortune of reading those Olympic old Russian manuals, you'll just see dozens and dozens of these things with different grips and pulling from blocks or below the knee or above the knee or mid-thigh or the crease to power position to full squat position. Same thing with snatches. Dozens of squat variants with different stances, different bar positions, and all this other shit. And the theorists of the day said that they believed that as athletes got more advanced, they needed more variety, which I find funny because in the modern era, the exact opposite has proven to be true. Training has become far more specific than it ever was. But that's how they approached it. They used classical periodization. During the off-season, they would do a lot of sub-maximal, relatively volume, sets of 3s, 5s, 75 to 85%, just shit tons of volume. They were also throwing a lot of drugs at it. And then as they got closer to competition, they would ramp up to 90-95%. They would usually save all that maxes for the platform, at least if what I've read is accurate or true. Now, I don't know what they're doing now, but this is, classical 60s, 70s, 80s style. And that's how everybody did it. And then Ivan Abajev came along with the Bulgarian system, and he threw all that shit out. He believed in pure specificity because he was involved in a sport that would allow it. And he stripped all that crap out. Whereas by pretty much the major part of his career, his lifters did competition snatch, competition clean and jerk, back squat for general strength, and front squat, which is actually specific to the clean recovery. They did power movements on the in-between days as a little bit of a lighter day. And you'd hear about the occasional lifter doing pulls off the floor, but that was about it. And I'm told that prior to his passing, he theorized that elite lifters that had the decade buildup, that had no weak points, that had reached that level, could do nothing but full snatch, full clean and jerk, and front squat, which again helps with the clean and jerk recovery, with nothing else. To my knowledge, he never tested that before he passed away. He trained them to singles with the occasional double, daily maxes. They were lifting the heaviest weight they could lift every day. There was no submaximal run-up. There was no general preparation. There was none of the shit the Russians had done. And everyone told him he was crazy until his athletes started kicking ass. Because they would simply do the competition essentially every day, multiple times a day, 7 days a week. And then once a month he actually would do mock competitions because he felt that that brought his lifters to the next level. And in as much as it broke most athletes, in as much as it was boring, in as much as it's generally accepted that he did that to keep his athletes from running around chasing tail so they'd be tired all the time, it did work. At least in the lighter weight classes. Bulgarians didn't tend to field a lot of bigger lifters. Now, I spoke to Glenn Pendlay about this before he passed when I wrote my overwritten series, and he pointed out that, yeah, most people will probably agree that the Bulgarian system is great if you have no weak points. But if you do, the Russian system allows for more weak point training to fix, limitations. But the Bulgarian system proved that in Olympic lifting, you could simply do the competition over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, and then over again some more, and do maximum singles all the time, and succeed. Because what his lifters would do is they would do that, and then on competition day, they would simply go do what they'd done every day in training. And I dare say that when the Bulgarian system got popular, most teams of the day used some variants of that. The Greek team did it under Iovakos, and I know I mispronounced that. Many teams, the Cubans would do more volume in the off season and then do Bulgarian going into the meet to be more specific so they wouldn't break, kind of a hybrid system. But I think most of the teams of the day saw that, okay, practicing relentlessly with heavy weights is key. And it's interesting in that regards. I read a piece by the coach of the female Olympic lifter who won gold, Olivia Reeves, and he trained her very much like that, in the sense that he didn't do endless volume at 85%. He had her using mostly singles, low reps, 90%, so she could do less volume, recover better. Timing on the Olympic list does change. When you go from 75, 80% to 90, 95%, it allowed him to identify weak points with heavy weights without breaking her. And, I mean, she got the success from that. So there is an element of truth to that, not necessarily to the extremes. Because now I want to discuss what I dare say is probably the best hybrid approach of Olympic lifting training that will point to, what specificity is in this sport. Let me back up and just ask the question, well, what is specificity when it is applied to Olympic lifting? And it sort of comes down to sort of a mix of what I've talked about based on the biomotor capacities. Number one, you obviously have to be practicing the lifts. They require relentless technical work. The snatch, proportionally more than the clean and jerk. For heavy weights, heavy being relative. I'm not talking about maxes, but you will not see an Olympic lifter doing cleans for sets of 12, especially at the higher levels. There may be assistance work involved that is specific to the Olympic lifts, to the weak points. If you have a lifter who has trouble from the crease in the hip, on their finish, in a Russian system, you would give them a weak point exercise, an assistance exercise, where they work on that specific thing. That is specific to the Olympic lifts, and it is building a portion of that. Squats, back squats, especially more of a general leg exercise, although it probably helps with the pull off the floor, is important to a degree, but Olympic lifters have big squats, but not as big as you would think. They usually only, 10 or 20% above their best clean and jerk, because more strength is not necessarily better. The front squat is specific to the clean and jerk recovery. So those movements certainly are picked based on that. The movement is done that itself, and then you pick specific movements that are not only specific to any weak points, but also specific to the weak point of the lifter, right? A mistake that's often made is assuming, oh, my clean and jerk isn't improving. I'm going to pick some random weak point exercise, assistance exercise that work for someone else, but if it's not specific to their weak points, it will not help them. Which brings me to a brief discussion of training at the fringe. The concept of training at the fringes doesn't apply as much to Olympic lifting as it does to other sports that I talked about, again, due to the really limited number of biomotor capacities, and because you can sort of technically train that one with nothing but doing the competition movement in competition style all the time. But that doesn't mean that it's not done. And I mean even outside of the specific assistance movements and those things. So you've got the competition movement, which has a strength component and a speed component. And you will occasionally, especially in the Russian system, but you see those occasionally in the Bulgarian system, you might do the following. So if a lifter needed to work on their speed a little bit, they might do the power movement. It's about 20% lighter and lets you go a little bit faster. If they needed a little bit more strength, they might do heavy pulls in clean grip or snatch grip to, again, maybe 5 or 10% above their best, along with doing the competition movement. That's about it. But that's, again, predicated on doing the Olympic lifts all the time, which Olympic lifters do. I mean, occasionally you'd see the Russians doing nothing but the broken movements for a big portion of the year. And then they would, I believe, slot in the full competition movements. By and large, nobody does that. Now, you might ask the question, what about hypertrophy? What about muscle size? Is that relevant to the Olympic lifting? The answer is yes and no. Over the decades, the body types and muscularity of Olympic lifters has changed enormously. When the Americans were successful, since they loved being big and strong, you saw big muscular physiques, because that's most of what they did, because what they liked. And the press needed a lot more upper body strength. As the Europeans came in, you would frequently see, especially snatch specialists, that looked relatively unmuscled. And I mean, Alexiev, who was one of the greatest lifters of all time, you go look at him, he just looks like, you could see a physique like that at Walmart. And he was one of the greatest lifters of all time. And at the same time, you would occasionally see muscular guys. And then in the modern era, as I'm going to talk about in a second, you have the Chinese who have made getting jacked a national mandate. Because in their conception, a larger muscle is a potentially stronger muscle. So we might add specific hypertrophy training as a fringe training element. So sort of summing up, early on we had the Russian system, tons of variety, lots of broken movements, lots of assistance exercises that were specific to the Olympic lifts and the lifter. I mean, the Bulgarian system was pure specificity all the time, nothing but the full competition movements for the most part, done for maximum singles every day. Which brings me to, in the modern era, the dominant team right now is the Chinese Olympic lifting team, who in my opinion has put together the best of all the systems. Because here's what they do. Basically, they are practicing the full Olympic lifts almost daily so far as I can tell. To that, they do weak point assistance exercises picked by the coach under his careful eye. They do heavy squats twice a week for general strength, and they do a ton of bodybuilding work. Because Jeremy Lenicky notwithstanding, they believe that a larger muscle is potentially a stronger muscle, potentially is the key. They just did a ton of bodybuilding work, it wouldn't improve their Olympic lifts. But by doing the Olympic lifts all the time, by putting in those assistance movements while doing the Olympic lifts, while doing the bodybuilding work, while doing the Olympic lifts, the body learns to use that increased muscle mass during the movements. Is the bodybuilding work specific to the clean and jerk and snatch? Not in the strictest sense, but is it specific to their performance? Yeah. So that's specificity in Olympic lifting. It is unique among sports, and in terms of the weight room, in that the weight room is the sport, or at least the movements you can do in the weight room are the sport, unlike weight training for non-strength sports. But it is one of the two sports, strongman again is a weird hybrid place, that you can actually do nothing but the competition itself in training, and at least to one degree or another be successful, as the Bulgarians were. I don't think anyone trains pure Bulgarian anymore, but most of them have elements of that in that they are training the Olympic lifts constantly with relatively heavy weights, to which they add specific weak point exercises, specific both to the lifts themselves and to the lifter's needs. Some amount of back squatting, general strength, usually front squatting, and then at least in the case of the Chinese, and I don't know about any other lifters or any other systems, a lot of bodybuilding work. Which brings me to. So, for those of you who don't know, powerlifting is a sport where you perform a full meet as 3 movements: squat, bench, deadlift. Some do bench only, some do bench and deadlift, some do deadlift only. Neither here nor there. You do single attempts, 3 per lift, with the goal being to lift the most weight one time. So it's very much like Olympic lifting in the sense that it has a limited number of biomotor capacities. It is more maximal strength than Olympic lifting, which is more explosive strength. There is no endurance component. There is a work capacity component. You need to be able to fight off the fucking boredom of sitting at a meet for 6 hours from start to finish. Take a book. But other than that, it is identical with one major exception. And that is, despite people not liking to hear it, the technical demands of powerlifting are nothing like Olympic lifting. Because as I pointed out in a previous video, and will reiterate, powerlifting is a sport where many successful lifters have practiced the lifts only once a week. And in at least one system, not even that. And it's the only sport where it can work because it does work, and it does work because it can work. And I'm not saying that that's how you should or should not train. I'm simply saying it's the only activity where you can actually get away with it. No Olympic lifter could get to the top snatching once a week. Louis' hilarious article series years ago, notwithstanding. It could not be done. And in powerlifting, it can be done. So that's the major difference between the two, which means that pretty much all the comments I made are mostly identical, but let's run through them quickly. So specificity in powerlifting is very similar to in Olympic lifting, in the sense that you have the competition movements that need to be trained heavily to some degree, and I'll talk a little bit about training systems here in a second. Competition squat, competition bench, competition deadlift. You've got variants on those: safety squat, bar squat, Zercher squat. West Side has a zillion squat variants, most of which nobody uses anymore. Bench press variants, wide grip bench, close grip bench. Deadlifts, you can deadlift from mats, boxes, I suppose. You can do deficit deadlifts, that is the variant on the competition movement. You go a step further back, movements that are specific to fixing weak points, a good morning if a lifter gets tipped over a lot, a rack pull if their deadlift lockout is weak, an RDL if they're bad at the transition from below to above the knee, things of that nature. And as I'll talk about when I talk briefly about training at the fringes, you've got hypertrophy work. Because unlike Olympic lifting, powerlifting is true maxes. They are maximum strength sports, in which case muscle size arguably plays a much larger role, again, Jeremy Lenicky notwithstanding. You do not see aerobic work, cardiovascular work by and large. There was a big push on like general physical preparation, West Side with dragging sleds and things of that nature, but like Olympic lifting, there is no endurance component other than the endurance to sit through a day's meet. So it is those very limited biomotor capacities, and that is represented in the training that is done. And I'll just talk really training at the fringes. It's basically the same as in Olympic lifting, where you've got your competition movements for singles. I mean, that's the competition package. You will occasionally see overload movements of varying sorts, whether it's board presses, occasional supermaximal eccentrics, those come in and out of style. Speed work used to be a thing back during the West Side days, but honestly, speed is not really a relevant capacity for Olympic lifting. There are faster and slower lifters, but it's a lot of grind. Hypertrophy and muscle size tend to play a larger role in powerlifting as well in two ways. One, since it's more on the maximal strength end of things rather than explosive strength, you do need more muscle size. You also see more balanced muscular development in the average powerlifter versus the average Olympic lifter. Olympic lifting is really mostly legs and back, even if the Chinese have made jacked part of their national identity. But powerlifting, because of the deadlift requires upper back strength and size to get to lockout. The bench press requires chest, shoulders, and triceps. You tend to see more balanced muscular development among powerlifters, and that tends to be reflected in the type of training that's being done in the majority, at least compared to most traditional Olympic lifting systems. So that's training at the fringes, and maybe work capacity work if needed, so that you don't need 10 minutes of being on an oxygen tank between maximum squats, which is not unheard of in some super heavyweight lifters. It is a sport where in premise, you can just do the competition lifts for maximum singles all the time. It's different in terms of the way it loads the body and joints, and that's why Bulgarian powerlifting always shits the bed. Greg Knuckles' old hilarious book, the most recent version of it I've seen, notwithstanding. Your joints give out, your connective tissue gives out. I dare say nobody trains like that. I dare say the majority of powerlifting systems have used a combination of the competition lifts pretty much year-round, to one degree or another, with assistance work of some sort. I mean, you go back and look at Cohn and Karwoski and those guys, and they squatted year-round, they squatted heavy, and then they did assistance work as needed. I think the only system that really got away from that, and was able to get away with, was West Side, in that they did very little competition work. I maintain that the dynamic effort work was more technical. It was the closest to competition work that they did. At least they were box squatting and benching, but it's neither here nor there. But that kind of makes my point about powerlifting, is that you can actually be successful without almost ever doing the full competition movements, and that's not true in any other sport. I'm not saying you should, but I'm saying clearly it can be done. Although that was also, Louis was optimizing for gear, and if you look at like the raw variants of Westside, it always included full competition work along with the max effort and dynamic effort work and hypertrophy stuff, so there might be a lesson in there. Now, Westside, for its strengths and many weaknesses, was partially a response to the classical periodization models of the day, right? So you go back into like late 70s, early 80s, like Ed Cohn and Karwoski and those guys. And the way they would typically cycle their weights is they would start at like 12s to 15s and go like 10, 8, 5, 3, 1, because they were basing on that Stone periodization article that literally set back the strength and conditioning world for decades. And what guys like Louis and those folks found was that all you did when you were in 15s was you were detraining your top end. And you were losing your maximum strength to build muscle size. And that by the time you got to the lower repetitions, you might be rebuilding your max strength, but you were losing the muscle size that you had gained. Even as Cohn's system developed, he eventually got to the point that he never did more than sets of 5 in the competition movements. Now, he would cycle the weights and he would move them up, and he also didn't take them to grinding limits. He kept a couple reps in the tank, and he still pyramid up to new peak. But that prevented him from detraining the top end. He saved higher reps for the assistants and other stuff, and he did very simple assistance work. And I dare say in the modern era, the biggest change in high-level powerlifting training is that lifters are no longer straying too far from heavy weights. They're at least keeping a little bit of 90% or 85 to 95% plus weights in their program, always staying in touch with heavy weights. Right? You look at, say, Matt Gary, who's the coach of U.S. powerlifting team. He does singles only in deadlift, and then anywhere from 1 to 3 in the squat and bench. He sees no point in straying out of that repetition range, because as you get into lighter weights, just like with Olympic lifting, it becomes less specific, even if you're still squatting, benching, and deadlifting. The timing changes. Lighter weights, even to failure, and I'm not advocating failure, guys, I'm just saying, are not the same as lifting a maximum weight. It's like I talked about with the specificity of adaptations. Squats for 12s may build hypertrophy in the squatting muscles, which there's no such thing, in various muscles, but it's not specific to maximum strength. To do that, you need to practice heavy weights with low repetitions, and that's been a big trend. And to that, other things are added as needed in terms of weak point work, supplemental work, and of course hypertrophy work, which brings me to, and I'd only note, from the time I was training powerlifters initially in the late 90s, I always did it kind of the way the Chinese did it, right? Is heavy singles in the competition movements, because not maxes, but 85, 90% range. And then I would do assistance work to fix weak points. And then we would do what I call donkey work, hypertrophy stuff. And that just made sense to me to get practice with the competition movements, fix weak points, which change, and then support that with muscle, with hypertrophy work, which was bodybuilding work. And one of these days I should do a video detailing her training, just because people might find it interesting. But that's what I did with Sumi for the entire 8 years of her career. She did squat, bench, competition, deadlift year-round. There was never a time she didn't, ever, for a number of reasons. Partly because you need to be practicing your sport all the time, and partly because she would forget how to do them if she went more than a few days. Since I trained her predominantly with singles, exclusively with singles on squat and deadlift, and then occasional doubles on bench, she did a shit ton of assistance work. That was actually most of her volume. I fixed her weak points and targeted what she needed with heavy good mornings to support her squat. I mentioned some of this heavy hack squat to improve the bottom position. Trap bar deadlift, rack pull, RDL to improve her deadlift, start, middle, lockout, ton of donkey work and bodybuilding work, and a shit ton of low back work to protect that because of the way she deadlifted, which was amazing but tragic if you've seen it. And I put the video up before. And make no mistake, I'm not saying that's the way to train. It's probably more common for powerlifters to do squat, bench, deadlift variants, things like Zercher squats and safety squat bar squats and board presses for lockout, and deadlift from either height or whatever. I didn't do that with her because it would interfere with her motor patterning. So I did the specific movements, and then I did what would be considered, I guess, semi-specific assistance work, in that it is a good morning specific to a squat in the strictest sense? No, but it's that, like I said, there's a much wider continuum in the weight room, like I talked about in part 4. So it's specific to her competition performance package, in that when she would get bent over, if she could get it to her good morning position, her body would go, oh, I've done this before, and good morning into the top. That's how I approached it with her. More typically would be doing, I think, what are called supplemental, basically variants on the competition work. I don't use them. Most people do. And that just made sense to me. But the key was that all that assistance work was being done on the base of all the specific work, having her work at 85-90% singles year-round, which we would peak up, into the strength cycle to new maxes, and then she would go to her competition and set new numbers, and then we'd start all over again. So again, with the exception of the technical demands not being there, powerlifting is much like Olympic lifting in that the weight room work is the sport. And you can at least get much, much closer. I mean, you can actually mimic and duplicate the sport itself during your training. And even if that doesn't work in the strictest sense, in most systems in the modern era, you will see relatively heavy work to some degree on the competition movements that is then supported by varying amounts of relatively more or less specific to the lifts and to the lifter, assistance work, supplemental, again, what I just call assistance work, and then hypertrophy and injury preparation, prevention work. And that's it. And systems do differ, but they're probably all more similar than not. And since this got too long again, part 6, specificity for hypertrophy. I swear to God, I will finish it up then. See you next week.